December 16, 1944. The morning began with silence so deep it seemed unnatural. In the forests near the small German town of Monschau, frost clung to the branches like crystal veins, and the snow absorbed every sound. But then, as if the earth itself exhaled in agony, the stillness shattered. American artillery thundered from unseen ridgelines, the air filled with the scream of shells cutting through the icy dawn. Among the German infantry of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, the veterans recognized the sound immediately. High velocity, heavy caliber. But this morning, something was wrong. The explosions were not striking the frozen ground ahead or bursting among the trees. Instead, the air itself erupted above them. Dozens of shells detonated mid-flight, spreading thousands of steel fragments downward in a deadly rain. Foxholes offered no protection. Trenches, no refuge. Men who had survived the furnace of Stalingrad now found death descending from the sky in ways they could not understand. For a moment, even the thunder of war paused, replaced by the disbelieving cries of men who realized the old rules of survival had vanished. Far behind the lines, in a small, mud-caked command post, Colonel Oscar Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group leaned over a field map. His breath fogged in the bitter cold as he studied the coordinates for the advancing German columns. Against orders, without clearance from higher command, he had given the signal that morning: fire proximity fuses. Axelson knew the consequences. Court-martial, disgrace, perhaps worse. But he also knew what was at stake. The American 38th Cavalry Squadron was being overrun by German forces nearly 10 times their number. To follow orders meant to lose the line entirely. So, in defiance of procedure but in faith to survival, he chose to unleash the Allies' most closely guarded secret: a new kind of artillery fuse, one that could think. To the gunners, it looked ordinary. A small metallic tip attached to each shell, no larger than a man's fist. But inside that casing lay one of the most sophisticated inventions of the war: a self-contained radar system that could detect its distance from the ground and detonate at precisely the right height to maximize destruction. As the first proximity-fused shells arced over the frozen Ardennes, the air above Monschau filled with invisible pulses of radio energy. Each shell became a hunter, searching for its prey, waiting to sense the moment when the reflected signal grew strongest, when the earth and the soldiers upon it were close enough. Then, without warning, it exploded. German soldiers had no name for it. Some thought the Americans had learned to control lightning. Others believed their own anti-aircraft fire had malfunctioned. In their diaries, survivors described it simply: death came from the air, and no hole was deep enough. At the same moment, across the front, radio operators struggled to make sense of the reports pouring in. The initial German offensive, Hitler's last gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, had begun with tremendous promise. Under the veil of winter fog, more than 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces had surged westward through the Ardennes. Hitler's generals had promised him that this would split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and reverse the war's course. The Americans had been caught off guard. Many units were resting, composed of replacements so new they barely knew each other's names. Entire regiments had been scattered by the first assault. Yet in the chaos, one decision, Axelson's, had turned a small patch of snow-covered forest into a crucible of technological warfare. To the soldiers in the field, the effect was immediate and horrifying. Each explosion hung in the sky like a burst of light before dissolving into a swarm of razor-edged fragments. The usual rhythm of combat, the whistle, the impact, the brief safety between barrages, had vanished. Now there was no warning, no pattern, no mercy. By midday, German battalions that had once advanced confidently through the mist were stopped cold. Entire platoons lay scattered across the snow, their rifles half buried beside them. In the shattered silence that followed each salvo, the survivors could hear only the faint ticking of falling shrapnel striking the frozen ground. Back at the gun line, American artillery crews worked with mechanical precision. The breech slammed open, shells were rammed home, the metallic click of a fuse setter echoed again and again. They had been trained to operate quickly, to maintain discipline even as the battlefield shook around them. Few of them knew what made these fuses different, only that they worked. And they did. The proximity fuse multiplied the lethality of each shell many times over. The mathematics of death had been rewritten. But behind this new weapon lay not just the decision of one colonel, but an entire hidden world of scientists and engineers. Thousands of miles away, in a nondescript building disguised as a used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, Dr. Merrill Tuve and his team at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had labored in total secrecy. They had taken a concept that most physicists believed impossible, building a radar small enough, strong enough, and smart enough to survive being fired from a gun, and made it real. Inside every fuse were more than 100 tiny components, including miniature vacuum tubes designed by Dr. James Van Allen. These tubes, each no bigger than a pencil eraser, could withstand the crushing acceleration of 20,000 times the force of gravity. When fired, a glass ampule broke inside, releasing chemicals that powered the radar's brief, brilliant life, just long enough for it to find a target and end another. It had taken an industrial miracle to make such precision possible. By late 1944, more than 100 American companies were building proximity fuses. RCA, Sylvania, General Electric, Crossley, all working under secrecy so strict that workers could not tell their families what they did. Each fuse was tested, tracked, and approved under standards more rigorous than those used in any other weapon program, even the atomic bomb. The cost was staggering, over $1 billion, second only to the Manhattan Project. But its value would soon be measured not in dollars, but in lives. As evening fell on the first day of the German offensive, the forests around Monschau glowed with ghostly light from artillery bursts. Smoke drifted between the trees, catching the moon's reflection like a veil of silver fog. German medics moved among the wounded, their lanterns dim to avoid detection. One young corporal, his face pale beneath his steel helmet, stared upward into the night sky as the last shell exploded above him. He whispered to the chaplain beside him, "They can see us, even in the dark." Across the lines, an American gunner slumped beside his howitzer, rubbing his frozen hands together. He didn't know that his battery had just altered the course of the entire battle. All he knew was that the shells had done something new, something powerful. And for the first time that winter, he dared to believe they might survive the coming storm. In the command posts of both armies, reports began to circulate. German officers spoke of air-detonating shells, of radar-controlled artillery. Some dismissed them as rumors. Others feared something far worse, that the Americans had developed a weapon beyond comprehension. Colonel Axelson's decision had saved his men, but it had also broken one of the highest restrictions of the war. The proximity fuse had been reserved strictly for anti-aircraft defense, never for ground combat, in case the Germans recovered a dud and learned its secrets. But on that frozen morning in December 1944, secrecy had given way to necessity. The weapon that was never meant to be fired at men had now been unleashed upon them, and once unleashed, there would be no turning back. The battle would rage for weeks, across snow-choked forests and shattered towns. The tide of the Bulge would rise and fall, but from that morning onward, every German soldier who faced American artillery faced an enemy that could see without eyes, calculate without thought, and strike with impossible precision. In the still, frozen quiet of the Ardennes, humanity had crossed another invisible threshold. The age of technological warfare had truly begun. Night descended over the Ardennes like a curtain drawn across a stage of ruin. The air hung heavy with smoke and frozen mist. Where the snow had once been white, it was now gray and black, scorched by thousands of shells. The first day of Hitler's final offensive had ended not with triumph, but with confusion. His generals had promised him lightning, the kind that would split the Allied front in days. but lightning, it seemed, now belonged to the Americans. At the forward aid station of the 326th Volksgrenadier Division, lanterns flickered over rows of wounded men. Some lay silent, others whimpered softly. The battalion surgeon, his uniform stiff with frozen blood, moved between them with a mechanical calm. He had seen artillery wounds before, shrapnel tearing through flesh, concussive trauma, burns, but never like this. The injuries were from above. Skulls split by fragments that had fallen vertically, backs torn open by rain from the sky. Even the foxholes, once sanctuaries of survival, had become tombs. On the other side of the battlefield, the 38th Cavalry Squadron huddled in snow-covered positions, astonished to still be alive. Their commander, Major Robert Gibb, stared through binoculars at the distant tree line where the German assault had vanished. The snow was littered with dark shapes that didn't move. His radio man handed him a note. "Axelson's artillery has stopped them cold." In that moment, Gibb didn't yet know that the man behind that miracle might soon face punishment for it. At the 406th Artillery Group headquarters, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson sat beneath a tarpaulin strung between pine trees. The wind rattled its edges like an accusation. He had broken one of the most sacred orders in the Allied playbook: do not use proximity fuses for ground fire. But the alternative had been annihilation. He recorded his decision in a brief line of his field log that evening. Situation critical. Ordered use of VT shells. Results conclusive. He closed the notebook and looked out into the night. In the distance, the thunder of guns rolled across the forest like a heartbeat. While Axelson contemplated his fate, word of the weapon's effect was already racing through Allied command channels. Reports arrived at 1st Army headquarters describing an artillery effect unlike any previously recorded. German attacks were collapsing before they even reached American lines. Some units spoke of enemy troops surrendering en masse, too terrified to continue under airbursts that offered no refuge. But to the men in charge of Allied secrecy, this was a disaster. For nearly 2 years, the proximity fuse had been guarded with a level of security rivaling the atomic bomb. Its existence was known to only a handful of officers outside the scientific establishment. The fear was simple. If a single intact fuse fell into German hands, they could reverse engineer the technology within months. And if Germany deployed its own version, the skies over London, already scarred by V-1 rockets, would become death traps for Allied bombers. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight D. Eisenhower received the first coded reports of the unauthorized use. He understood instantly the magnitude of the breach, but also the urgency. The Ardennes offensive had achieved almost total surprise. American divisions were collapsing, their lines fractured. The 106th Infantry had lost 2 entire regiments in the Schnee Eifel. Bastogne was encircled. The British, too far north to intervene quickly, could only watch as the German tide surged westward. Eisenhower faced the same moral equation as Axelson had: secrecy or survival. He knew that the proximity fuse might be the only weapon capable of stemming the assault. On December 19th, he made his decision. Authorization was granted. The fuse could now be used freely, against tanks, infantry, any target that moved. The effect was immediate. Within 48 hours, crates marked VT began arriving at artillery positions across Belgium and Luxembourg. The men who opened them had no idea what they contained, only that they were to be handled with extraordinary care. In Bastogne, surrounded and cut off from supply, the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion received their share, 75mm pack howitzers fitted with the same deadly technology first fired at Monschau. The town had become the heart of the Bulge, its defenders the last obstacle between Hitler's panzer armies and the Meuse River. Inside Bastogne, snow drifted into the streets like white ash. The 101st Airborne, hungry and frozen, held their perimeter with rifles half frozen to their gloves. Above them, the sky pulsed with the glow of artillery flashes. At dawn, on December 22nd, German infantry launched their most determined assault yet. Hundreds of men advanced through the snow, their dark uniforms forming lines that rippled across the fields. From the church tower, American spotters saw the movement and radioed fire coordinates. Moments later, the air above the German advance filled with proximity-fused shells. Witnesses would later describe it as a storm made of fire and steel. The explosions burst 30 feet above the ground, overlapping like an orchestra of thunder. The snow vanished in clouds of smoke. Men dropped where they stood, many without ever seeing the source of their death. When the smoke cleared, the field was silent. From his command post, General Anthony McAuliffe, the man who had replied, "Nuts," to the German surrender demand, watched the effect with grim astonishment. He turned to his staff and said softly, "That's not artillery. That's a force of nature." Among the American gunners, awe mixed with unease. The power of the proximity fuse felt almost unnatural. One crewman from the 463rd later wrote home, "It's like the shells can think. They find the enemy even when we can't see them." The Germans, meanwhile, were unraveling. Their field commanders sent frantic radio messages demanding explanations. Their forward units described air bursts without sound of impact, detonations that followed troops as they advanced. Veterans who had faced Soviet barrages in the east now called the American fire the invisible scythe. On the night of December 23rd, the 969th Field Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit under Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, joined the defense. Their 150mm howitzers lined the perimeter southwest of Bastogne. These men, often denied recognition and equality within their own army, would soon deliver one of the most decisive blows of the battle. As German infantry massed for another push through the forest, Barnes gave the order. The big guns opened fire, the recoil shaking snow from the trees. The shells soared into the night, their radar eyes searching for the unseen. Seconds later, a ring of explosions illuminated the forest canopy. Shattered branches and shards of steel rained down together. German survivors later described it as a storm that burned the sky. By dawn, the assault had broken. Entire companies had vanished in minutes. American positions that should have been overrun still held. Beyond Bastogne, similar reports came from the 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion and the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery. Everywhere the new fuse appeared, the results were the same. German advances stopped dead in their tracks. But victory brought an unexpected consequence: disbelief. The weapon's effects were so overwhelming that some German officers refused to believe it was man-made. They suspected the Americans were using chemical weapons, or even magnetic mines hidden in the snow. Prisoners captured near Bastogne spoke of ghost shells that exploded without touching anything. In the quiet moments between barrages, soldiers from both sides listened to the echo of distant guns, wondering what kind of future could emerge from weapons that killed so perfectly. As the siege tightened, snow continued to fall, covering the frozen bodies in the fields. The wind moved across the white landscape, whispering through broken helmets and empty rifles. Beneath that silence lay a truth that few yet understood. The nature of war itself had changed. The proximity fuse was not merely a weapon. It was a harbinger of an age in which machines could sense, decide, and destroy on their own. In the frozen heart of the Ardennes, that future had already arrived. The third week of December 1944 dawned beneath a pale sun that did little to melt the frost or the fear. The Ardennes had become a wasteland of twisted trees, shattered tanks, and frozen corpses half buried in snow. Along the southern shoulder of the German advance, the Third Army was on the move, an immense grinding machine of men and steel clawing its way north toward the besieged town of Bastogne. At its head rode General George S. Patton. Yeah, to the soldiers who followed him, Patton seemed carved from iron and ice. He drove his divisions through blizzards and mud, pushing men and armor forward when every road was a sheet of frozen death. The order from Eisenhower had been clear: relieve Bastogne at all costs. But even Patton's audacity would have meant nothing without the invisible guardians that now cleared his path, the proximity fuses whispering in their shells. On December 23rd, the weather broke. For the first time in a week, the clouds lifted and the skies filled with the drone of Allied bombers and fighter planes. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was barely a shadow of itself. Its few remaining aircraft were torn apart by P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs before they could even approach the front. Below, American artillery crews took advantage of the clear air, sighting their guns with newfound precision. Columns of German infantry moving along forest trails suddenly vanished in curtains of fire. Shells burst overhead, timed perfectly by unseen hands. The fragments scythed through ranks of men, shredding their winter coats, tearing apart command posts and ammunition wagons. In the village of Lutrebois, a young German officer named Friedrich Henke tried to rally his men amid the chaos. He had once believed in Hitler's vision, in the idea of a 1,000-year Reich. But now, surrounded by death from an unseen sky, that belief crumbled like the walls around him. Each time he raised his head to shout an order, another explosion answered him. The air itself had turned hostile. Henke later wrote in his journal, found weeks later in the ruins of a farmhouse, "The Americans have found a way to make the air hate us. Their shells burst before they touch the ground. There is no cover, no chance, no mercy. It is like fighting against God." By Christmas Eve, Patton's vanguard had reached the outskirts of Bastogne. The men of the 37th Tank Battalion could hear the distant rumble of artillery echoing through the hills. They advanced cautiously, each bend in the icy road hiding the threat of mines or ambush. But the closer they drew to the town, the more they realized something had changed. The German resistance, once fierce and unrelenting, had thinned into scattered pockets of confusion. American airbursts had shattered not only enemy formations but their morale. German field radios crackled with fragments of despair, reports of men refusing to advance, officers missing, ammunition running out. Entire regiments were being erased before they could even deploy. In Bastogne itself, the defenders sensed the shift. The siege that had seemed unbreakable now trembled. From his command post in a half-collapsed schoolhouse, General McAuliffe received word that Patton's forces were less than 5 miles away. Outside, paratroopers stood by fires made from broken furniture, their faces hollow from hunger but their spirits unbowed. When the sound of distant engines reached them, it felt like the first breath after drowning. At 4:50 p.m. on December 26th, a single Sherman tank from Company C, 37th Tank Battalion, broke through to the town's southern perimeter. The road behind it was littered with the wreckage of trucks and German half-tracks, remnants of a shattered counterattack. Bastogne was relieved. But while one battle ended, another was only beginning. To the east, the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were in full retreat. What had begun as a daring offensive had turned into a desperate struggle to survive. Hitler's grand gamble had failed, undone by logistics, weather, and the unrelenting precision of Allied artillery guided by proximity fuses. As the German columns withdrew through the narrow valleys near the Sauer River, American observers spotted them from the ridges. The signal went out to the artillery batteries. Within minutes, hundreds of guns thundered in unison. The shells rose into the night sky like flocks of burning birds. At 20 feet above the riverbanks, they began to burst. One after another, a cascade of fire reflected in the dark water. For the German soldiers below, it was a massacre. Trucks exploded. Men dove into the freezing river, some drowning before the current carried their bodies downstream. Others froze where they lay, hands raised toward a sky that no longer offered mercy. The proximity fuse had turned retreat into slaughter. The Americans called it efficiency. The Germans called it apocalypse. In the weeks that followed, German prisoners captured along the Meuse spoke in hushed tones about the new American shell. Some believed it was radio-controlled. Others thought it contained a small machine that could sense life. One sergeant told his interrogators, "The air itself fights for you now." Yet, among the Allied ranks, even as victory approached, the awe carried a trace of unease. The men knew that this new technology was a step into something unknown. War waged by intelligence, not instinct. The shell that could sense its target seemed to strip humanity from the equation altogether. At the Aberdeen Proving Ground months later, one of the scientists who had worked on the fuse reflected on the reports from the front. "We built it to save lives," he said quietly, "but when I read what it did at Bastogne, I couldn't sleep for days." In early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge finally collapsed. The last of the German panzers sputtered out of fuel, their crews abandoning them to the snow. The Ardennes became a graveyard of ambition, a white field littered with black wreckage. The frozen forests that had echoed with the thunder of artillery now stood silent, their branches heavy with snow and ghosts. The proximity fuse had done more than repel an offensive. It had accelerated the end of the German army in the west. By spring, Allied forces would cross the Rhine and drive toward Berlin, and though the world would soon learn of an even deadlier weapon born from the same fever of invention, it was in these frozen woods that the age of electronic warfare had truly begun. The fuse, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, had changed the laws of battle. It had turned artillery from blind force into intelligent death. And yet, as history would later record, that intelligence came with a cost, a faint echo of the future to come, when machines would learn to seek, to decide, and perhaps to destroy without us. By mid-January 1945, the Ardennes lay buried beneath a silence so deep it seemed unnatural. The thunder of artillery had ceased. Only the creak of ice and the distant crack of collapsing trees disturbed the stillness. American soldiers moved through the snow-covered remains of what had once been the German spearhead. Burned-out Panthers, overturned trucks, and the frozen bodies of soldiers from both armies lay strewn across the roads. The smell of cordite still lingered in the air, a ghost of fire refusing to fade. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bulge had cost dearly: 80,000 casualties, towns reduced to rubble, forests cratered into moonscapes. Yet, amid the ruin, there was the knowledge that the line had held. The Wehrmacht, once feared as invincible, had been broken. The weapon that had tipped the balance, the proximity fuse, remained largely unknown to those who fought beside it. Its existence was a rumor whispered in canteens and dugouts. To most gunners, it was simply a new type of shell that worked better in the cold. Only a handful of officers and scientists understood what they had truly unleashed. In a laboratory far from the front lines, at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory in Maryland, a small group of engineers followed the battle reports with quiet astonishment. Many had worked day and night for 3 years, soldering circuits the size of fingernails, testing vacuum tubes under vibration and temperature extremes. Their project had once been deemed impossible, a bomb that could think. They called it variable time, or VT for short, a name deliberately vague to conceal its nature. Inside the steel casing of each fuse was a marvel of wartime science, a miniature radar transmitter and receiver. When the signal it emitted bounced off a nearby object, be it an airplane, a wall, or a human body, the circuit closed and the shell detonated. For decades, the gunner's art had depended on guesswork and timing. Now, for the first time, the weapon itself could decide when to strike. At the start, the U.S. Navy had been its greatest believer. Fitted to anti-aircraft shells, the proximity fuse had saved entire fleets from Japanese kamikaze attacks in the Pacific. Each detonation in midair meant fewer pilots crashing into carriers, fewer ships burning. The Army, cautious and skeptical, had joined later. But in the frozen forests of Belgium, they had witnessed its perfection. Back in Germany, the aftermath was a study in disbelief. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding what was left of the Western Front, demanded intelligence on the new American weapon. His staff recovered fragments of unexploded shells, but the circuitry within was destroyed beyond recognition. No one in his command grasped how close they had come to uncovering a secret as important as the atom bomb. Among the survivors of the Ardennes, the psychological scars ran deep. Many German soldiers who endured the proximity shell fire described recurring nightmares, the sound of explosions above them, the sensation of being hunted by invisible eyes. One veteran later told a post-war historian, "It was not like normal artillery. It knew where we were. It felt alive." For the Americans, too, the weapon inspired awe mixed with unease. Chaplains leading Sunday services near the front often included prayers for those who had died beneath the very shells that had saved their comrades. Some men said the technology was too perfect, too cold. One sergeant, asked to describe the feeling of watching a VT barrage, said only, "It was like God had picked up the guns himself." Meanwhile, in London, Winston Churchill received the first detailed reports from SHAEF describing the success of the proximity fuse. The British had been partners in its development, though they too had kept it secret even from their own parliament. Churchill, a man who loved both poetry and weaponry, wrote in a private memo, "This invention may well rank with radar and the breaking of Enigma. It is a scientific triumph and a solemn warning to mankind." The fuse's inventor, Merle Tuve, refused any personal credit. When offered a medal for his role, he declined, saying, "The war demanded it. That is reward enough." But among his colleagues there was quiet concern. The fuse represented a step toward something irreversible, a weapon that no longer relied on human judgment for its most critical moment. As Allied armies crossed the Rhine in March 1945, the proximity fuse continued its deadly service. In the dense German cities of Cologne, Koblenz, and Wesel, it became the unseen guardian of advancing infantry, bursting shells above snipers, machine gun nests, and ambushes hidden in rubble. It shortened battles that might have lasted days. Yet with every success it raised a question none could answer. What happens when war becomes too efficient? Even the enemy began to recognize the shift. Captured Wehrmacht documents from February contained one chilling line. The Americans now fight with machines that judge the distance to a man faster than a human heartbeat. When Hitler received reports of the new artillery fuse, he dismissed them as Allied exaggeration. But his generals knew better. They had watched divisions disintegrate under skies that seemed to explode on command. For them, it was the beginning of the end. As the winter turned to spring, the German army retreated toward its homeland. Bridges were blown, towns evacuated, and civilians streamed eastward, clutching children and memories alike. The Reich's once proud banners were replaced by white flags. And though the soldiers who surrendered often spoke of hunger, exhaustion, and defeat, some mentioned something stranger, a belief that the Americans possessed a weapon beyond human reach. In April 1945, the first shipments of proximity fuses arrived in the Pacific Theater, where they would soon be used against Japan. But by then, the world had entered a new phase of warfare. The fuse had proven that technology could replace instinct, that machines could fight with logic as precise as mathematics. When Berlin finally fell in May, and the guns fell silent across Europe, the survivors of the Ardennes, on both sides, struggled to understand what they had witnessed. They had fought in the last great battle of an old world and survived to see the dawn of a new one. In the ruins of Cologne, a German child picked up a small metal fragment from the street. It was part of a proximity fuse. Shattered, harmless now, but still gleaming faintly in the sunlight. He turned it over in his hand, wondering what it was. His mother, watching from the doorway of their bombed-out home, said softly, "It is something that listens." Spring came slowly to Europe in 1945. The snow that had buried the Ardennes melted into rivers of mud, washing over the bones of soldiers who would never be found. In the towns once fought over so bitterly, the air no longer smelled of smoke or blood, but of damp earth and rebuilding. Yet, beneath that fragile calm, the world was already shifting toward a new and uncertain future, one shaped by the weapons that had ended the old order. In Washington, London, and Los Alamos, scientists who had labored in secrecy now faced the uneasy realization of what their genius had created. The proximity fuse, born from radar, physics, and desperation, had become the silent twin of another, more infamous creation, the atomic bomb. Both had emerged from the same fevered race to end a war through intellect rather than numbers, and both had forced humanity to confront a truth it could never again unlearn, that thought itself could be weaponized. When President Truman was briefed on the role of the proximity fuse in halting the Ardennes offensive, he listened without interruption. The report described it as a force multiplier of immeasurable significance. Truman, a veteran artillery officer himself, understood the weight of that phrase. He closed the folder, placed it aside, and said only, "We have crossed into a different kind of century." In the years that followed, the secret of the fuse slowly emerged from the shadows. Declassified reports celebrated it as one of the decisive technologies of the war. Newspapers hailed it as the shell that thought for itself. The public, hungry for heroes and miracles, embraced the story as proof of Allied ingenuity. Few paused to consider what it meant that a machine could now determine the instant of death. For the soldiers who had fired those shells, the memory lingered differently. Veterans of Bastogne, Monschau, and the Sauer River seldom spoke of the proximity fuse directly. It was not something they took pride in, but something they respected, an unseen ally that had saved them at a cost they could not measure. One gunner, interviewed decades later, recalled, "When you saw what it did, you stopped cheering. You just loaded the next round." In post-war Germany, the ruins of cities told a story beyond victory or defeat. Scientists who once designed the V-2 rocket now worked for the very nations they had tried to destroy, their talents absorbed into new military projects on both sides of the emerging Cold War. Among them, the principles of the proximity fuse, miniaturization, autonomous sensing, decision at a distance, became the seeds of something larger. Missiles, jet-guided bombs, radar-seeking torpedoes all traced their lineage back to that small, humming circuit that once rode inside an artillery shell. The logic that had guided the fuse's detonation soon guided flight paths, tracking systems, and eventually computers. In the ashes of war, intelligence had taken its first mechanical form. In 1946, at a military symposium in Washington, one of the original fuse engineers delivered a quiet warning. "We have learned," he said, "that we can give our weapons the ability to think. What we have not yet learned is whether we should." His words were met with polite applause and quickly forgotten. As the world rebuilt, new wars followed: Korea, Vietnam, the Middle East. Each saw the legacy of the proximity fuse evolve. By the 1960s, artillery shells no longer relied on crude timing or human calculation. They could sense altitude, terrain, even the shape of a target. By the 1980s, missiles could choose the moment of impact with algorithmic precision. And by the dawn of the 21st century, drones patrolled the skies, their sensors a direct descendant of the radar pulse once trapped inside a steel shell. What began as a desperate attempt to stop German tanks in a frozen forest had become the blueprint for an age of autonomous warfare. Yet, amid the march of progress, the story of the fuse remained strangely forgotten, overshadowed by the blinding flash of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But to those who study history's quieter revolutions, it was the true turning point, the moment humanity handed the power of choice to its machines. In 1964, at the 50th anniversary of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, a handful of the surviving engineers gathered to commemorate their wartime work. They were older now, their hair silver, their hands unsteady. On display in a glass case was one of their original prototypes, its copper wiring tarnished, its vacuum tube clouded with age. One of them, Dr. Harry Diamond, stood before it for a long time. When asked how he felt seeing the fuse again after all those years, he said softly, "Proud, yes, but also haunted. We built something that could listen to the world and decide when to end a life. We thought we were inventing a fuse. We were inventing a question. Far from laboratories and museums, the forests of Belgium had healed. The craters had filled with rainwater, becoming ponds where children fished in summer. Moss covered the broken gun emplacements. Wildflowers grew through the rusted helmets. But beneath the soil, fragments of proximity fuses still slept, silent remnants of a war that had changed everything. Each spring, farmers turning their fields unearthed them, small and corroded, yet intact. They would carry them carefully to the edge of the property, where Allied bomb disposal teams still came, even after half a century, to collect the forgotten ghosts of that winter. Sometimes the teams would find the markings still visible. VT, Lot 1944. Sometimes, when the wind blew across the open fields, it seemed to whisper faintly through the trees, like the hum of a machine waiting to awaken. For those who remember, the Battle of the Bulge remains a story of courage and endurance, of men who held the line against impossible odds. But hidden within that story is another, a moment when humanity first glimpsed the future of its own invention, a future where the air itself could kill, where war no longer waited for a man to pull a trigger, where the mind of a weapon could act before the heart of a soldier could feel. And so, when historians speak of the proximity fuse, they speak not only of victory, but of warning. Because in that winter of 1944, amid the snow and smoke of the Ardennes, the world's first intelligent weapon was born. And from that moment on, the question that haunted Dr. Diamond would haunt us all. When machines can think, who decides what they are allowed to know?